Linking stress to health, the key biological systems are the sympathetic nervous system, SNS, and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, HPA, axis. When we are distressed, both the SNS and the HPA axis take up the challenge, secreting hormones that prepare us to handle an emergency or threat. But they do so by borrowing resources from the immune and endocrine systems, among others. That weakens these key systems for health, just for a moment or for years at a time. The SNS and HPA circuits are turned on or off by our emotional states. Distress for the worse, happiness for the better. Since other people affect our emotions with such power, through emotional contagion, for example, the causal linkage extends outside our body to our relationships. The physiological changes associated with the random ups and downs of relationships do not matter that much, but when those downs continue over many years, they create levels of biological stress, technically known as an allostatic load, that can speed the onset of disease or worsen its symptoms. How a given relationship affects our health will depend on the sum total of how emotionally toxic or nourishing it has been over months and years. The more frail our condition is, after the onset of a serious disease, while we are recovering from a heart attack, in old age, the more powerful the health impact of our relationships. The embattled, long-suffering, though long-lived Tolstoys seem a remarkable exception, like the odd centenarian who credits her longevity to eating lots of whipped cream and smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. The toxicity of insult. Elisa Janowitz stood by her principles, though it cost her her job, and possibly a case of hypertension. One day, a top executive from her cosmetics firm visited the perfume counter in a flagship San Francisco department store and ordered Janowitz, the regional sales manager, to fire one of her best-performing salespeople. The reason? He didn't think the saleswoman was attractive, or as he put it, hot enough. Janowitz, who felt the employee was not only a star at sales but perfectly presentable, found the executive's demand both groundless and disgusting. She refused to fire the woman. Soon afterward, Janowitz's bosses seemed to sour on her. Though she had recently been selected as the company's sales manager of the year, now suddenly they told her she was making mistake after mistake. She feared they were building a case to force her out. Over these trying months, Janowitz began to suffer from high blood pressure. When she took a medical leave, the company replaced her. Janowitz sued her former employer. However that case may be settled, as of this writing it continues to wend its way through court, it raises the question of whether her hypertension might have been due in part to the way her own bosses treated her. Consider a British study of healthcare workers who had two supervisors on alternate days, one they dreaded and one they liked. On the days the dreadful boss worked, their average blood pressure jumped 13 points for the systolic and 6 for the diastolic, from 113/75 to 126/81. While the readings were still in a healthy range, that much of an elevation, if maintained over time, could have a clinically significant impact. That is, speed the onset of hypertension in someone otherwise susceptible. Studies in Sweden of workers at different levels and in the United Kingdom among civil servants show that people in the lower positions in an organization are 4 times more likely to develop cardiovascular disease than are those in the top rungs, who don't have to put up with the whims of bosses such as themselves. Workers who feel unfairly criticized, or whose boss will not listen to their problems, have a rate of coronary heart disease 30% higher than those who feel treated fairly. In rigid hierarchies, bosses tend to be authoritarian. They more freely express contempt for their subordinates, who in turn naturally feel a messy mix of hostility, fear, and insecurity. Insults, which can be routine with such authoritarian managers, serve to reaffirm the boss's power while leaving their subordinates feeling helpless and vulnerable. And because their salary and very job security depend on the boss, workers tend to obsess over their interactions, reading even mildly negative exchanges as ominous. Indeed, across the board, just about any conversation with someone of higher status at work elevates a person's blood pressure more than does a similar conversation with a coworker. Take how one handles an insult. In a relationship among peers, An affront can be challenged, an apology asked for. But when the insult comes from someone who holds all the power, subordinates, perhaps wisely, suppress their anger, responding with a resigned tolerance. But that very passivity, with the insult going unchallenged, tacitly confers permission to a superior to continue in that vein. People who respond to insults with silence experience significant hikes in blood pressure. As the demeaning messages continue over time, the person holding back feels increasingly powerless, anxious, and ultimately depressed, all of which, if prolonged over long periods, markedly increases the likelihood of cardiovascular disease. In one study, 100 men and women wore devices that took readings of their blood pressure whenever they interacted with someone. When they were with family or enjoyable friends, their blood pressure fell. These interactions were pleasant and soothing. When they were with someone who was troublesome, there was a rise. But the biggest jump came while they were with people they felt ambivalent about. An overbearing parent, a volatile romantic partner, a competitive friend. A mercurial boss looms as the archetype, but this dynamic operates in all our relationships. We try to steer clear of people we find unpleasant, but many unavoidable people in our lives fall into this mixed category. Sometimes they make us feel good, and other times terrible. Ambivalent relationships put an emotional demand on us. Each interaction is unpredictable, perhaps potentially explosive, and so requires a heightened vigilance and effort. Medical science has pinpointed a biological mechanism that directly links a toxic relationship to heart disease. Volunteers for an experiment on stress had to defend themselves against a false accusation that they had shoplifted. As they talked, their immune and cardiovascular systems mobilized in a potentially deadly combination. The immune system secreted T lymphocytes, while the walls of blood vessels emitted a substance that binds to those T cells, setting in motion the formation of artery-clogging plaque on the endothelium. Most surprising medically was that even relatively minor upsets seemed to trigger this mechanism. Presumably, this distress to endothelium chain reaction would put us at risk for heart disease if such stressful encounters become routine events in our daily lives. The causal chain. It's all very well to find a general correlation between stressful relationships and poor health, and to identify a pathway or two in a possible causal chain. But despite the occasional studies suggesting biological mechanisms, skeptics often argue that very different factors may be at play. For instance, if a difficult relationship leads someone to drink or smoke too much or to sleep poorly, that might be a more immediate cause of ill health. So researchers have continued to look for a distinct biological link, one clearly separable from these other reasons. Enter Sheldon Cohen, a psychologist at Carnegie Mellon University who has intentionally given colds to hundreds of people. Not that Cohen has a malicious streak, it's all in the interest of science. Under meticulously controlled conditions, he systematically exposes volunteers to a rhinovirus that causes the common cold. About a third of people exposed to the virus develop the full panoply of symptoms, while the rest walk away with nary a sniffle. The controlled conditions allow him to determine why. His methods are exacting. Cohen's experimental volunteers are quarantined for 24 hours before they are exposed to be sure they have not picked up a cold elsewhere. For the next 5 days, and for $800, the volunteers are housed in a special unit with other volunteers, all of whom are kept at least 3 feet from one another lest they reinfect someone. During those 5 days, their nasal secretions are tested for technical indicators of colds, like the total weight of their mucus, as well as the presence of the specific rhinovirus, and their blood samples are tested for antibodies. This way, Cohen takes the measure of the cold with a precision that goes far beyond counting runny noses and sneezes. We know that low levels of vitamin C, smoking, and sleeping poorly all increase the likelihood of infection. The question is, can a stressful relationship be added to that list? Cohen's answer? Definitely. Cohen assigns precise numerical values to the factors that make one person come down with a cold while another stays healthy. Those with an ongoing personal conflict were 2.5 times as likely as the others to get a cold, putting rocky relationships in the same causal range as vitamin C deficiency and poor sleep. Smoking, the most damaging unhealthy habit, made people 3 times more likely to succumb. Conflicts that lasted a month or longer boosted susceptibility, but an occasional argument presented no health hazard. While perpetual arguments are bad for our health, isolating ourselves is worse. Compared to those with a rich web of social connections, those with the fewest close relationships were 4.2 times more likely to come down with the cold, making loneliness riskier than smoking. The more we socialize, the less susceptible to colds we become. This idea seems counterintuitive. Don't we increase the likelihood of being exposed to a cold virus the more people we interact with? Sure, but vibrant social connections boost our good moods and limit our negative ones, suppressing cortisol and enhancing immune function under stress. Relationships themselves seem to protect us from the risk of exposure to the very cold virus they pose. The perception of malice. Elisa Yanovitz is not alone in the indignities she suffered at work. A woman working at a pharmaceutical company sends me this email. I'm having personality clashes with my boss, who is not a very nice person. For the first time in my professional career, my confidence is shaken. And since she's friends with all of the upper hierarchy at my company, I feel I have no recourse. The whole thing is making me physically ill from the stress. Is she merely imagining the link between her toxic boss and her physical illness? Perhaps. On the other hand, her plight fits well with findings from an analysis of 208 studies involving 6,153 individuals who were subjected to stressors ranging from loud, obnoxious noises to confrontations with equally obnoxious people. Of all the sorts of stress, the worst by far was when someone was the target of harsh criticism and was helpless to do anything about it, like both Yanovitz and the pharmaceutical employee who clashed with her boss. Why this should be so has been revealed by Margaret Camini, an expert in behavioral medicine at the University of California Medical School in San Francisco, who analyzed hundreds of stress studies with her colleague Sally Dickerson. Threats or challenges, Camini told me, are most stressful when you have an audience and feel you are being judged. Stress reactions in all the studies were gauged by the rise in a person's level of cortisol. The largest spikes in cortisol occurred when the source of stress was interpersonal. For example, when someone sat in judgment on a volunteer who had to subtract the number 17 from 1,242 aloud, and then continue to subtract 17 from the resulting number as rapidly as possible. When a person performed such an onerous task while being judged on how they did, the effect on cortisol was about 3 times greater than when the stress was comparable but impersonal. Imagine, for example, that you're being interviewed for a job. As you talk about the talents and expertise that you believe qualify you, something unsettling happens. You see the interviewer responding to you with a stony, unsmiling expression, coolly making notes on a clipboard. Then, to make things worse, the interviewer makes critical remarks belittling your skills. That was the nerve-wracking predicament of volunteers for a devilish measure of social stress, all of whom were actually in the midst of applying for a job and had come for a practice interview. But the practice sessions were actually a stress test. Developed by researchers in Germany, this experimental ordeal has been used in labs around the world because it produces powerful data. Camini's lab routinely has used a variation of the test to assess the biological punch of social stress. Dickerson and Camini argue that being evaluated threatens the social self, the ways we see ourselves through others' eyes. This sense of our social value and status, and so our very self-worth, comes from the cumulative messages we get from others about how they perceive us. Such threats to our standing in the eyes of others are remarkably potent biologically, almost as powerful as those to our very survival. After all, the unconscious equation goes, if we are judged to be undesirable, we may feel not just shame, but complete rejection. An interviewer's unnerving hostile reaction reliably triggers the HPA axis to produce some of the highest levels of cortisol of any laboratory stress simulation ever tested. The social stress test hikes cortisol much more than does the classic lab ordeal, in which volunteers do increasingly difficult math problems under intense time pressure against annoying background noise, with a noxious buzzer signaling wrong answers, but without the presence of someone making nasty judgments. Impersonal ordeals are soon forgotten, but judgmental scrutiny delivers a particularly strong and lingering dose of shame. Astonishingly, a symbolic judge existing only in the mind delivers just as large a dose of angst. A virtual audience can affect the HPA system as powerfully as a live one, Kamini explains, because the moment you think of something, you create an internal representation which in turn acts on the brain, much as would the reality it represents. Feeling helpless adds to the stress. In the cortisol studies analyzed by Dickerson and Kamini, threats were perceived as all the worse when they were beyond the person's ability to do anything about them. When a threat persists, no matter what efforts we might make, the cortisol rise magnifies. This parallels the predicament of someone, for example, who finds himself the target of vicious prejudice, or those two beleaguered women whose bosses turned against them. Relationships that are continually critical, rejecting, or harassing keep the HPA axis in constant overdrive. When the source of stress seems impersonal, like an obnoxious auto alarm we are helpless to stop, our most basic need for acceptance and belonging goes unthreatened. Kamini found that for such impersonal stress, the body got over its inevitable jump in cortisol within 40 minutes or so. But if the cause was a negative social judgment, cortisol stayed high 50% longer, taking an hour or longer to return to normal. Brain imaging studies suggest which parts of the brain may react so strongly to such perception of malice. Recall from Chapter 5 the computer simulation in Jonathan Cohen's lab at Princeton, where volunteers in an MRI scanner played the ultimatum game. The game requires two partners to divide some money, with one making offers of a split that the other can accept or reject. When a volunteer felt that the other person had made them an unfair offer, their brain showed activity in the anterior insula, which is known to activate during feelings of anger and disgust. Fittingly, they showed signs of bitterness and were more likely to reject not just this offer but the next one too, whatever it might be. Yet when they believed that the other partner in the game was just a computer program, their insula stayed quiet, no matter how seemingly one-sided the offer. The social brain makes a crucial distinction between accidental and intentional harm, and it reacts more strongly if it seems malevolent. This finding may solve a puzzle for clinicians attempting to understand post-traumatic stress disorder, why catastrophes of similar intensity more often lead to lasting suffering if the person feels their trauma was purposely inflicted by someone else rather than a random act of nature. Hurricanes, earthquakes, and other natural catastrophes leave many fewer victims of PTSD than do malicious acts like rape and physical abuse. The after effects of trauma, like all stress, are worse the more personally targeted the victim feels. The Class of 57. It was in 1957 that Elvis Presley broke into America's national consciousness by appearing on the Sunday night Ed Sullivan Show, then the most watched hour on television. The American economy was in the midst of a lengthy post-war boom. Dwight D. Eisenhower was president. Cars had grotesque tail fins, and teens socialized at heavily chaperoned school dances called sock hops. In that year, researchers from the University of Wisconsin began to study about 10,000 graduating high school seniors, nearly a third of those in the entire state. These teens were later re-interviewed as they reached age 40 and again as they reached their mid-50s. Then, as they approached 65, a group of the grads were recruited for follow-up research by Richard Davidson at the University of Wisconsin and brought to the W.M. Keck Laboratory for Functional Brain Imaging and Behavior. Using measures far more sophisticated than anything available in 1957, Davidson undertook to correlate their social history, brain activity, and immune function. The quality of the grads' relationships over the course of their lives had been discerned in the earlier interviews. Now it was compared to the wear and tear on their bodies. The grads were assessed on the chronic activity of systems that fluctuate as they handle stress, including blood pressure, cholesterol, and levels for cortisol and other stress hormones. The sum of these and similar measures predicts not just the likelihood of cardiovascular disease, but also late life declines in mental and physical functioning. A very high total score predicts an earlier death. The researchers found that relationships mattered. There was a strong association between having a high-risk physical profile and an unfavorable cumulative emotional tone in the grad's most important life relationships. Take, for example, the anonymous class of 1957 graduate I'll call Jane. Her relationship life had been tough, a litany of disappointments. Both Jane's parents were alcoholics, and she saw little of her father during most of her childhood. He molested her while she was in high school. As an adult, she was extremely fearful of people, alternately angry at and anxious with those closest to her. Though Jane married, she soon divorced, and her scant social life offered her little solace. In the medical survey for Davidson's study, she had 9 out of 22 common medical symptoms. On the other hand, Jill, one of Jane's high school classmates, was the picture of a full and rich relationship history. Although Jill's father had died when she was just 9, she felt her mother had been extremely caring. Jill was close to her husband and her 4 sons, and she felt her family life was extremely satisfying. So too was her active social life, filled as it was with many close friends and confidants. And in her 60s, Jill reported having problems with only 3 of the 22 symptoms. Again, correlation is not causation. To demonstrate a causal link between relationship quality and health includes identifying the specific biological mechanisms at work. Here, the class of 1957 provided some telling clues based on Davidson's tests of brain activity. Jill, the woman with the caring mother, satisfying relationships, and very few medical complaints in her 60s, was the member of the class of 57 with the greatest activity in her left prefrontal cortex relative to the right. That brain activity pattern, Davidson has found, suggests that Jill's days were filled with mostly pleasant moods. Jane, whose parents had been alcoholics and who was divorced with many medical problems in her 60s, had the opposite brain pattern. She had the highest activity in her right prefrontal area relative to the left of anyone studied in her class. That pattern suggests that Jane more often reacted to life with intense distress and recovered slowly from her emotional setbacks. A high-road brain mechanism holds the key to managing the turbulence of the low. The left prefrontal area, as Davidson had found in earlier research, regulates a cascade of circuitry in lower brain areas that determine our recovery time from distress, that is, our resilience. The more of this left prefrontal activity, relative to the right side, the better we are at developing cognitive strategies for emotional regulation, and the faster our emotional recovery. That, in turn, determines how quickly cortisol returns to normal. Resilient health depends in part on how well the high road has learned to manage the low. Davidson's earlier study went one step further. His research group discovered that activity in the same left prefrontal area correlated highly with the ability of a person's immune system to respond to a flu shot. Those with the highest activation had immune systems that mobilized flu antibodies 3 times more than did others. Davidson believes that these differences are clinically significant. In other words, that those with high left prefrontal activity are less likely to get the flu if exposed to the virus. Davidson sees in such data a window on the anatomy of resilience. A soundly secure relationship history, he theorizes, gives people the inner resources to bounce back from emotional setbacks and losses, as was the case with Jill, the woman who lost her father at age 9 but whose mother was so loving. Those Wisconsin grads who endured relentless stress in childhood now as adults had poor stress recovery abilities, staying overwhelmed longer once they were upset. But those people who had been exposed to manageable levels of stress during childhood were most likely as adults to have the better prefrontal ratio. For this outcome, a caring adult who provides a secure base for emotional recovery seems essential. Social epigenetics. Laura Hillenbrand, the author of the best-selling book Seabiscuit, has long suffered from chronic fatigue syndrome, a debilitating condition that can leave her feverish and exhausted, needing constant care for months at a time. While she was writing Seabiscuit, that care came from her devoted husband, Borden, who, even while struggling with his own work as a graduate student, somehow found the energy to be her nurse, helping her eat and drink, assisting her when she needed to walk, and reading to her. But one night in her bedroom, Hillenbrand recalls she heard a soft, low sound. She looked down the stairway to see Borden pacing the foyer and sobbing. She started to call out to him, but stopped herself, realizing he wanted to be alone. The next morning, Borden was there to help her as usual, cheerful and steady as ever. Borden did his best to keep his own anguish from upsetting his already fragile wife. But, like Borden, anyone who has to nurse a loved one day and night endures extraordinary, unabated stress. And that tension takes an inevitable toll on the health and well-being of even the most devoted caretaker. The most powerful data on this point comes from a remarkable interdisciplinary research group at Ohio State University, led by psychologist Janice Key-Colt Glaser and her husband, immunologist Ronald Glaser. In an elegant series of studies, they have shown that the effects of continual stress reach all the way down to the level of gene expression in the immune cells, essential for fighting infections and healing wounds. The Ohio State group studied 10 women in their 60s, all of them caring for a husband with Alzheimer's disease. The caregivers were under relentless strain, on duty 24 hours a day, and feeling terribly isolated and uncared for themselves. An earlier study of women under similar stress had discovered that they were virtually unable to benefit from flu shots. Their immune system could not manufacture the antibodies that the shot ordinarily stimulates. Now, the researchers undertook more elaborate tests of immune function, revealing that the women in the Alzheimer's caregivers group had troubling readings on a wide range of indicators. The genetic data in particular made headlines. A gene that regulates a range of crucial immune mechanisms was expressed 50% less in the caretakers than in other women their age. GHM-RNA, the impaired gene, enhances the production of lymphocytes and also boosts the activity of natural killer cells and macrophages, which destroy invading bacteria. That may also explain another earlier finding. Stressed women took 9 days longer to heal a small puncture wound than did women in a non-stressed comparison group. A key factor in this impaired immunity may be ACTH, a precursor to cortisol and one of the hormones secreted when the HPA axis runs amok. ACTH blocks the production of the crucial immune agent interferon and diminishes the responsivity of lymphocytes, the white blood cells that mount the body's attack against invading bacteria. The bottom line? The continual stress of tireless caregiving in social isolation impairs the brain's control of the HPA axis, which in turn weakens the ability of immune system genes like GHM-RNA to do their job fighting disease. The toll of relentless stress also seems to strike the very DNA of the caretakers, speeding the rate at which cells age and adding years to their biological age. Other researchers doing genetic studies of DNA in mothers caring for a chronically ill child found that the longer they had been so burdened, the more they had aged at the cellular level. The rate of aging was determined by measuring the length of the telomeres on the mother's white blood cells. Telomeres are a piece of DNA at the end of a cell's chromosome that shrinks a bit each time the cell divides to duplicate itself. Cells reproduce repeatedly throughout their lifespan to repair tissue, or, in the case of white blood cells, to fight disease. Somewhere after 10 to 50 divisions, depending on the type of cell, the telomere becomes too short to replicate anymore, and the cell retires, a genetic measure of loss of vitality. By this measure, the mothers caring for chronically ill children were, on average, 10 years older biologically than others of their same chronological age. Among the exceptions were those women who, despite feeling overwhelmed in their lives, felt well supported by others. They had younger cells, even if they were caring for a disabled loved one. Collective social intelligence can offer an alternative to the overwhelming toll of caregiving. Witness the scene in Sandwich, New Hampshire, where Philip Simmons sat in his wheelchair on a brilliant fall day, surrounded by friends and neighbors. At age 35, Simmons, a college English teacher with 2 small children, had been diagnosed with the degenerative neurological condition Lou Gehrig's disease and given 2 to 5 years to live. He had already outlived his prognosis, but now the paralysis was moving from his lower body to his arms, making him unable to perform even routine tasks. At this point, he gave a friend a book called Share the Care, which describes how to create an ongoing support group for someone with a severe illness. 35 neighbors rallied to help Simmons and his family. Coordinating their schedule largely by phone and email, they acted as cooks, drivers, babysitters, home aides, and, as on that fall day, yard workers for the last several years of Simmons' life until he died at age 45. This virtual extended family made an immense difference for Simmons and his wife, Catherine Field. Not least, their help enabled Field to continue her work as a professional artist, easing the financial strain and giving the entire family, in her words, a sense of being loved by our community. As for those who formed FOPAC, Friends of Phil and Catherine, as they called themselves, most agreed that they were the ones receiving the gift. Chapter 17. Biological Allies. When my mother retired from teaching college, she found herself with a large, empty house and no one to fill it. Her children had all ended up living in other cities, some quite distant, and my father had died years before. A former professor of sociology, she made what, in retrospect, seems a smart social move. My mother offered a free room to graduate students from her university, with a preference for those from East Asian cultures where older people are appreciated and respected. It's been more than 30 years since she retired, and this arrangement still continues. She has had a revolving series of housemates from places like Japan, Taiwan, and currently Beijing, with what seemed to be great benefits for her well-being. When one couple had a baby while living with her, their daughter grew up treating my mother like her own grandmother. As a 2-year-old, the toddler would go into my mother's bedroom every morning to see if she was up yet and routinely give her hugs through the day. That baby was born when my mother was almost 90. And with that bundle of delight roaming the house, my mother actually seemed for a few years to get younger, both physically and mentally. We'll never know how much of my mother's longevity can be attributed to her living situation, but evidence suggests hers was a wise bit of social engineering. The social networks of the elderly are pruned for them as one old friend after another dies or moves away. But at the same time, older people also tend to cut back their social networks selectively, preserving positive relationships. That strategy makes good biological sense. As we grow old, our health inevitably becomes more fragile as cells age and die. Our immune system and other bulwarks for good health work less and less well. Dropping unrewarding social ties may be a preemptive move to manage our own emotional states for the better. Indeed, a landmark study of elderly Americans who were aging successfully found that the more emotionally supportive their relationships, the lower their indicators of biological stress like cortisol. Of course, our most meaningful relationships may not necessarily be the most pleasant and positive ones in our lives. A close relative can be someone who drives us crazy rather than delights us. Perhaps luckily, as older people prune away less significant social ties, many seem to develop a greater capacity for handling emotional complications, such as the mix of positive and negative feelings stirred up by a given relationship. One study found that when elderly people had an engaging, supportive social life, they displayed better cognitive abilities 7 years later than did those who were more isolated. Paradoxically, loneliness has little or nothing to do with how much time people actually spend by themselves, nor how many social contacts they have in a given day. Instead, it's the paucity of intimate, friendly contacts that leads to loneliness. What matters is the quality of our interactions, their warmth or emotional distance, their supportiveness or negativity. The sense of loneliness, rather than the sheer number of acquaintances and contacts a person actually has, correlates most directly with health. The lonelier a person feels, the poorer immune and cardiovascular function tends to be. There's another biological argument for becoming more intentional about our interpersonal world as we age. Neurogenesis, the brain's daily manufacture of new neurons, continues into old age, though at a slower rate than in earlier decades. And even that slowdown may not be inevitable, some neuroscientists suggest, but rather a side effect of monotony. Adding complexity to a person's social environment primes new learning, enhancing the rate at which the brain adds new cells. For this reason, some neuroscientists are working with architects to design homes for the elderly where occupants have to interact more with others in the course of their daily routines, something my mother arranged for herself. The marital battleground. As I leave the grocery store in a small town, I overhear two elderly men sitting on a bench outside. One asks how a local couple is doing. "You know how it is," comes the laconic reply. "They've only ever had one argument, and they're still having it." Such emotional wear and tear in a relationship, as we've seen, takes its biological toll. Just why a marriage gone sour might sabotage health was found when newlyweds, all considering themselves very happy in their marriages, volunteered to be studied while they had a 30-minute confrontation about a disagreement. During the tiff, 5 of 6 adrenal hormones tested changed levels, including increases in ACTH that indicate a mobilized HPA axis. Blood pressure shot up, and indices of immune function were lowered for several hours. Hours later, there were long-term shifts for the worse in the immune system's ability to mount a defense against invaders. The more bitterly hostile their argument had been, the stronger the shifts. The endocrine system, the researchers conclude, serves as one important gateway between personal relationships and health, triggering the release of stress hormones that can hamper both cardiovascular and immune function. When a couple fights, their endocrine and immune systems suffer, and if the fights are sustained over years, the damage seems to be cumulative. As part of the study of marital conflict, couples in their 60s, married an average 42 years, were invited to the same laboratory for a closely monitored disagreement. Once again, the argument spurred unhealthy declines in the endocrine and immune systems. The more rancor, the greater the drops. Since aging weakens the immune and cardiovascular systems, hostility between older partners can take a greater toll on health. Sure enough, the negative biological changes were even stronger in older couples than for the newlyweds during the marital battle, but only for the wives. This surprising effect held true for both newlywed and older married women. Understandably, the newlywed wives who showed the greatest decline in immune measures during and after the fight were the most dissatisfied with their marriages a year later. For women, when husbands withdrew in anger during disagreements, stress hormones zoomed upward. On the other hand, wives whose husbands displayed kindness and empathy during the discussion reflected their relief in lower levels of the same hormones. But for husbands, whether the talk was harsh or pleasant, their endocrine systems did not budge. The sole exception was at the extreme, among those who reported the most abrasive arguments at home. For these embattled couples, both husbands and wives had poorer immune responses from day to day than did more harmonious couples. Data from multiple sources suggest that wives are more vulnerable to suffer the health costs of a rocky marriage than are their husbands, yet women do not seem to be more biologically reactive than men in general. One answer may be that women put a greater emotional premium on their closest ties. Many surveys of American women show that positive relationships are their major source of satisfaction and well-being throughout life. For American men, on the other hand, positive relationships rate lower in importance than a sense of personal growth or a feeling of independence. In addition, women's instinct for caregiving means they take more personal responsibility for the fate of those they care about, making them more prone than men to getting distressed at loved ones' troubles. Women are also more attuned to the ups and downs of their relationships and so are more susceptible to riding an emotional roller coaster. Another finding: wives spend far more time than their husbands ruminating about upsetting encounters, and they review them in their minds in more vivid detail. They also remember the good times better and spend more time reminiscing about them. Because bad memories can be intrusive, repeatedly popping into the mind unbidden, and because simply recalling a conflict can trigger the biological shifts that accompanied it, the tendency to mull over one's troubles takes a physical toll. For all these reasons, troubles in a close relationship drive adverse biological reactions in women more strongly than in men. In the Wisconsin study, for instance, women's cholesterol levels were directly linked to the amount of stress in their marriages, far more so than for men in the class of '57. In a study of patients with congestive heart failure, a stormy marriage was more likely to lead to an early death for women than for men. Women are also more likely to have a heart attack when they experience emotional stress from a severe relationship crisis like a divorce or death, while for men, the trigger is more likely to be physical exertion. And older women seem more vulnerable than men to life-threatening rises in stress hormones in response to a sudden emotional shock, like the unexpected death of a loved one, a condition doctors are calling the broken heart syndrome. Women's greater biological reactivity to relationship ups and downs begins to answer that long-standing scientific puzzle. Why men, but not women, seem to experience a health benefit from being married. That finding appears over and over in surveys of marriage and health, and yet is not necessarily true. What muddied the waters has been a simple failure of scientific imagination. A different picture emerged when a 13-year study of close to 500 married women in their 50s asked the simple question, "How satisfied are you in your marriage?" The results were crystal clear. The more pleased a woman was with her marriage, the better her health. When a woman enjoyed the time she spent with her partner, felt they communicated well, and agreed on matters like finances, enjoyed their sex life, and had similar interests and tastes, her medical data told the story. Levels of blood pressure, glucose, and bad cholesterol were lower for the satisfied women than for those unhappy in their marriages. Those other surveys had lumped together data from miserable and happy wives. So while women appear to be more biologically vulnerable to the ups or downs in their marriage, the effects of that emotional roller coaster depend on the nature of the ride. When she has more downs than ups in her marriage, a woman's health suffers. But when her relationship gives her more ups, her health, like her husband's, benefits. Emotional rescuers. Picture a woman in the maws of an MRI, lying on her back on a gurney that's been wheeled into a human-shaped cavity, one that leaves just inches to spare, in the midst of this vast piece of machinery. She's hearing the unsettling whine of huge electric magnets whirling around her and peering at a video monitor just inches above her face. The screen flashes a sequence of colored geometric shapes, a green square, a red triangle, every 12 seconds. She's been told that when a certain shape and color come on the screen, she'll receive an electric shock. Not very painful, but unpleasant nonetheless. At times, she endures her apprehension alone. At other times, a stranger holds her hand. And sometimes she feels the reassuring touch of her husband's hand. That was the predicament of 8 women who had volunteered for a study in Richard Davidson's laboratory, one designed to assess the extent to which the people we love can lend us biological assistance in moments of stress and anxiety. The results, when a woman held her husband's hand, she felt far less anxiety than when she faced the shock alone. Holding a stranger's hand helped a bit, though not nearly so much. Intriguingly, Davidson's group found that it was impossible to conduct the study so that the women were blind to whose hand they were holding. On a trial run, wives always guessed correctly whether the hand was their husband's or a stranger's. When the wives faced the shock alone, fMRI analysis showed activity in regions of the brain that drive the HPA axis into its emergency response, pumping stress hormones through the body. Had the threat been not just a mild shock, but personal, say a hostile job interviewer, these regions almost certainly would have been even more aroused. Yet this volatile circuitry was pacified strikingly with the calming clasp of a husband's hand. The study fills in an important blank in our understanding of just how our relationships can matter biologically, for better or for worse. We now have a snapshot of the brain undergoing emotional rescue. Just as telling was another finding. The more highly satisfied a wife feels with her marriage, the greater the biological benefit from holding hands. This clinches the answer to that old scientific mystery of why some marriages appear to challenge women's health, while others protect it. Skin-on-skin touch is particularly soothing because it primes oxytocin, as do warmth and vibration, which may explain much of the stress relief that comes from massage or a cozy cuddle. Oxytocin acts as a stress hormone downregulator, reducing the very HPA and SNS activity that, when sustained, puts our health at risk. When oxytocin releases, the body undergoes a host of healthy changes. Blood pressure lowers as we slide into the relaxed mode of parasympathetic activity. That shifts metabolism from the ready-to-run large muscle boost of stress arousal to a restorative mode where energy goes into storing nutrients, growth, and healing. Cortisol levels plummet, signifying decreased HPA action. Our pain threshold rises, so that we are less sensitive to discomforts. Even wounds heal faster. Oxytocin has a short half-life in the brain. It's gone in just a matter of minutes. But close, positive long-term relationships may offer us a relatively steady source of oxytocin release. Every hug, friendly touch, and affectionate moment may prime this neurochemical balm a bit. When oxytocin releases again and again, as happens when we spend good time with people who love us, we seem to reap the long-term health benefits of human affection. The very substance that draws us closer to the people we love then converts those warm connections into biological well-being. Back to the Tolstoys. Despite all the rancor recorded in their journals, they managed to have 13 children. That hoard means they lived in a household that was bustling with abundant opportunities for affection. The couple did not have to rely only on each other. They were surrounded by emotional rescuers. Positive contagion. Just 41, Anthony Radziwill lay dying in the intensive care unit of a New York hospital from fibrosarcoma, a deadly cancer. As his widow Carol tells it, Anthony was visited by his cousin John F. Kennedy Jr., who was himself to die just months later when the plane he was piloting crashed off the island of Martha's Vineyard. John, still in a tuxedo from the black tie event he'd just left, got the news as he entered the ICU that the doctors had given his cousin just hours to live. So taking hold of his cousin's hand, John quietly sang The Teddy Bear's Picnic, a song his own mother, Jackie Onassis, had sung to them both as a lullaby when they were small. Anthony, near death, joined in softly. John, as Radziwill recounts, had taken him to the safest place he can find. That sweet touch surely eased Radziwill's final moments, and it bespeaks the sort of connection that intuitively seems the best way to help a loved one. That intuition now has solid data to support it. Physiologists have shown that as people become emotionally interdependent, they play an active role in the regulation of each other's very physiology. This biological entrainment means that the cues each partner receives from the other have special power to drive their own body, for better or for worse. In a nourishing relationship, partners help each other manage their distressing feelings, just as nurturing parents do their children. When we are stressed or upset, our partners can help us rethink what's causing our distress, perhaps to respond better or simply to put things in perspective. In either case, short-circuiting the negative neuroendocrine cascade. Being separated from those we love for long periods deprives us of this intimate help. The longing for people we miss expresses in part a yearning for this biologically helpful connection. And some of the utter disorganization we feel after the death of a loved one no doubt reflects the absence of this virtual part of ourselves. That loss of a major biological ally may help explain the heightened risk of disease or death after a spouse passes away. Again, an intriguing gender difference emerges. Under stress, a woman's brain secretes more oxytocin than a man's. This has a calming effect and moves women to seek out others, to take care of children, to talk to a friend. While women tend or befriend, as psychologist Shelley Taylor at UCLA discovered, their bodies release additional oxytocin, which calms them even more. This tend and befriend impulse may be uniquely female. Androgens, male sex hormones, suppress the calming benefits of oxytocin. Estrogen, the female sex hormone, enhances it. This difference seems to lead women and men to very different reactions when they are facing a threat. Women seek out companionship, while men go it alone. For instance, when women were told they would receive an electric shock, they chose to wait for it with other participants, while men preferred being by themselves. Men seem better able to calm their distress through sheer distraction. TV and a beer may suffice. The more close friends women have, the less likely they are to develop physical impairments as they age, and the more likely they are to lead a joyful life in their later years. The impact appears to be so strong that friendlessness has been found to be as detrimental to a woman's health as smoking or obesity. Even after experiencing an enormous blow like the death of a spouse, women with a close friend and confidant are more likely to escape any new physical impairments or loss of vitality. The primal template for forming a tight biological link with those closest to us was set in early infancy, in the intimate physiology of our earliest interactions. These brain-to-brain mechanisms stay with us throughout life, connecting our biology with the people to whom we are most attached. Psychology has an infelicitous term for this coalescing of two into one, a mutually regulating psychobiological unit, a radical relaxing of the usual psychological and physiological line separating I and you, self and other. This fluidity of boundaries between people who feel close allows a two-way co-regulation, influencing each other's biology. In short, we help or harm each other not just emotionally, but at a biological level. Your hostility bumps up my blood pressure. Your nurturing love lowers it. If we have a life partner, a close friend, or a warm relative on whom we can rely as a secure base, we have a biological ally. Given the new medical understanding of just how much relationships matter for health, patients with severe or chronic disease may well benefit from tuning up their emotional connections. In addition to following the medical regimen, biological allies are good medicine. A healing presence. When I was living in rural India many years ago, I was intrigued to learn that hospitals in my area typically provided no food for their patients. More surprising to me was the reason. Whenever a patient was admitted, their family came along, camping out in their room, cooking their meals, and otherwise helping care for them. How wonderful, I thought, to have the people who love a patient there with him day and night to ward off the emotional toll of his physical suffering. What a stark contrast with the social isolation so often found in medical care in the West. A medical system that deploys social support and caring to help boost patients' quality of life may well enhance their very ability to heal. For example, a patient lying in her hospital bed, awaiting major surgery the next day, can't help but worry. In any situation, what one person feels strongly tends to pass to others, and the more stressed and vulnerable someone feels, the more sensitive they are, and the more likely to catch those feelings. If the worried patient shares a room with another patient who also faces surgery, the two of them may well make each other more anxious and fearful. But if she shares a room with a patient who has just come out of surgery successfully, and so feels relatively relieved and calm, the emotional effect on her will be more soothing. When I asked Sheldon Cohen, who led the studies on rhinovirus infection, what he recommended for hospital patients, he suggested they deliberately seek out biological allies. For example, he told me that it can pay, he argues, to graft new people onto your social network, especially people you can open up to. When a friend of mine got the diagnosis of a probably fatal cancer, he made a smart medical decision. He started seeing a psychotherapist he could talk with as he and his family went through the subsequent maelstrom of angst. As Cohen told me, the most striking finding on relationships and physical health is that socially integrated people, those who are married, have close family and friends, belong to social and religious groups, and participate widely in these networks, recover more quickly from disease and live longer. Roughly 18 studies show a strong connection between social connectivity and mortality. Devoting more time and energy to being with the people in our lives whom we find most nourishing, Cohen says, has health benefits. He also urges patients, to the extent possible, to reduce the number of emotionally toxic interactions in their day, while increasing the nourishing ones. Rather than having a stranger teach a heart attack victim how best to avoid a recurrence, Cohen suggests hospitals should enlist the personal networks of patients on their behalf, educating those who care most about the patient to become allies in making the necessary lifestyle changes. As important as social support is to the elderly and sick, other forces work against the fulfillment of their need for warm connection. Not least is the awkwardness and anxiety that friends and families often feel around a patient, particularly when the patient has a condition that carries social stigma, or when a patient faces death. People who are ordinarily close can become too wary or anxious to offer help or even to visit. Most of the people around me step backward, recalls Laura Hillenbrand, the author who is bedridden for months at a time with chronic fatigue syndrome. Friends would ask other friends how she was, but after one or two get well cards, I stopped hearing from them. When she took the initiative to call old friends, the conversations were often awkward, and she ended up feeling foolish for calling. And yet, like anyone cut off by illness, Hillenbrand yearned for contact, for connection with those missing biological allies. As Sheldon Cohen says, the scientific findings absolutely send a message to patients' family and friends not to ignore or isolate them. Even if you don't know quite what to say, it's important just to go visit. This advice suggests to all of us who care about someone suffering medically that, even if we feel at a loss for words, we can always offer the gift of a loving presence. Mere presence can matter surprisingly, even to patients in a vegetative state with severe brain damage who seem utterly unaware of what people say to them, who are in what medical jargon labels a minimally conscious state. When someone emotionally close reminisces with such a patient about events from their past or touches them lightly, the patient activates the same brain circuitry in response as do people with intact brains. Yet they appear totally out of touch, unable as they are to signal so much as a glance or word in response. A friend tells me that, by chance, she read an article about people who had recovered from coma. They reported that they often could hear and understand what people said, even as they lay there unable to move a muscle. She happened to read that article on a bus as she traveled to be with her mother, who was minimally conscious following resuscitation from congestive heart failure. This insight transformed her experience sitting at her mother's bedside as she drifted away. Emotional closeness helps most when patients are medically fragile, when they have a chronic disease or an impaired immune system, or when they are very old. While such caring is no panacea, emerging data suggests that it may sometimes make a clinically meaningful difference. In this sense, love is more than just a way to improve the emotional tone of a patient's life. It is a biologically active ingredient in medical care. For that reason, Mark Pettis, a physician, urges us to recognize the subtle messages that signal a patient's needs for even a moment of caring connection, and to act on the invitations to enter that take the form of a tear, a laugh, a look, or even silence. Pettis' own young son was in the hospital for surgery, overwhelmed, scared, confused, and unable to understand what was happening because, developmentally slow, he had not yet learned to talk. After surgery, his young son lay in bed dwarfed by a web of tubes attached to him, an IV in his arm taped to a board, a tube through his nostril into his stomach, oxygen tubes in his nostrils, another sending anesthesia into his spinal canal, yet another running through his penis to his bladder. Pettis and his wife felt heartbroken that their sweet child had to go through all this. Yet they could see in his eyes that they were able to help him through small gestures of human warmth, reassuring touches, heartfelt looks, simple presence. As he says, love was our language. Chapter 18. A People Prescription. A medical resident in the spine clinic at one of the world's best hospitals was interviewing a woman in her 50s who was in great pain from severe disc degeneration in her neck. She'd had the problem for years, but she had never before consulted a physician. Instead, she had been going to a chiropractor whose manipulations brought her only temporary relief. The pain was gradually increasing, and she was afraid. The woman and her daughter peppered the resident with their questions, doubts, and fears. For 20 minutes or so, the resident tried to address their concerns and allay their fears, but he had not quite succeeded. At that point, the attending physician entered the room and briskly described the facet joint injections that she recommended to calm the inflammation, as well as the physical therapy that should follow to stretch and strengthen the neck muscles. The daughter could not understand how these treatments would help and started directing a stream of questions toward the physician, who by then had stood up and was backing toward the door. Ignoring the physician's tacit cue that the conversation was ending, the daughter kept right on asking one question after another. After the attending physician left the room, the resident stayed with them another 10 minutes until the patient finally agreed to have the injection. A short time later, the attending physician took the resident aside and said, "That was nice of you, but you can't afford the luxury of that kind of prolonged conversation with the patient. We are scheduled for 15 minutes per patient, and that includes dictation time. You'll be cured of this after you spend a few sleepless nights dictating your notes and have to come back early the next morning for a full day at the clinic." "But I care about my connection with patients," the resident protested. "I want to establish rapport, really understand them. I'd spend a half hour with each one if I could." At that, the attending physician, a bit exasperated, closed the door so they could talk in private. "Look," she said, "there were 8 other patients waiting. It was selfish of that woman to stay so long. You just can't spend more than 10 minutes with each patient. That's all we have time for." She then walked the resident through the mathematics at that hospital of time per patient and the portion of each payment that finally reaches the doctor after taxes are taken, cuts deducted for malpractice insurance, for hospital overhead, and for other privileged parties. The result: if a doctor billed $300,000 each year to patients, he would be left with about $70,000 for his salary. The only way to make more money was to cram in more patients in less time. The too long waits and too short doctor's visits that increasingly typify medicine please no one. It's not just the patients who suffer from the creeping takeover of medicine by the accountant's mentality. Increasingly, physicians complain that they just can't take the time they want with patients. The problem is not confined to the United States. As a European neurologist who works for his country's national health plan lamented, they're applying the logic of machines to people. We report what procedures we do when, and then they compute how much time we should spend with each patient. But they don't include any time to talk to patients, to relate, to explain, to make them feel better. Lots of doctors are frustrated. They want to have time to treat the person, not just the disease. The prescription for physician burnout is written during the notoriously grinding hours of medical school and residency. Combine that relentless workload with medical economics that demand more and more from physicians, and it's small wonder that a creeping desperation is growing. Surveys find signs of at least some degree of burnout in 80 to 90% of practicing physicians, a quiet epidemic. The symptoms are clear: work-related emotional exhaustion, intense feelings of dissatisfaction, and a depersonalized I-it attitude. Organized lovelessness. The patient in 4D had been admitted for multi-drug-resistant pneumonia. Given her advanced age and a host of other medical problems, the outlook was dire. Over the weeks, she and the night nurse had struck up something of a friendship. Other than that, she had no visitors, not a soul listed to notify in case of death, and no known friends or relatives. As he dropped by on his night rounds, the nurse was her only visitor, and the visits were limited to the short conversations she could manage. Now her vital signs were failing, and the nurse recognized that the patient in 4D was near death. So he tried to spend every spare minute on his shift in her room, just being present. He was there to hold her hand during her last moments of life. How did his supervisor respond to this gesture of human kindness? She reprimanded him for wasting time and made sure her complaint was registered in his personnel file. "Our institutions are organized lovelessness," as Aldous Huxley put it so bluntly in The Perennial Philosophy. This maxim applies to any system that regards the people who inhabit it solely from an I-it stance. When people are treated as numbered units, interchangeable parts of no interest or value in themselves, empathy is sacrificed in the name of efficiency and cost-effectiveness. Take a common predicament: the hospital inpatient who has been scheduled for an X-ray that day. He'll be told first thing in the morning, "You're going to radiology for an X-ray." But he will not be told that the hospital makes more money, at least in the United States, from its outpatient X-rays than from those for inpatients, whose tests are paid for as part of a bundled payment from their insurance company. The hospital has to make do with whatever total amount is in that bundle, making that X-ray a potential money loser. And so inpatients are last in line, waiting, often anxiously, for a procedure they believe could come in 5 minutes, but that may not take place for 5 hours. Even worse, for some tests, patients must fast starting at midnight the night before. If the test is delayed until the afternoon, the patient gets neither breakfast nor lunch. Revenue guides how services are handled, one hospital executive told me. We don't consider how we would feel if it were us waiting. We don't pay enough attention to patients' expectations, let alone manage them as well as we could. Our operations and information flow are set up for the convenience of the medical staff, not the patients. But our knowledge of the role of emotions in health suggests that ignoring patients as people, even in the interest of some vaunted efficiency, causes us to forfeit a potential biological ally, feeling human concern. I do not mean to argue for being soft. A compassionate surgeon still must cut, and a compassionate nurse must still perform painful procedures. But the cut and the pain hurt less when an air of kindness and concern go along with them. Being noticed, felt, and cared for alleviates pain to a meaningful degree. Distress and rebuff amplify it. If we are to shift to more humane organizations, change will be required at 2 levels, within the hearts and minds of those who provide the care and in the ground rules, both explicit and hidden, of the institution. Signs of the desire for such a shift are abundant today. Recognizing the human being. Imagine a doctor, a successful heart surgeon, who is emotionally detached from his patients. Not only is he lacking in compassion, but he is also quite dismissive, even disdainful of them and their feelings. A few days ago, he operated on a man who had jumped out of a 5th-floor window in a suicide attempt and seriously injured himself. Now, in front of his students, all medical residents, the surgeon tells the patient that if he wanted to punish himself, he would have done better to take up golf. The students laugh, but the patient's face reveals his anguish and despair. A few days later, this same surgeon has become a patient. He feels a tickle in his throat and has been coughing up blood. The hospital's throat specialist examines him, and as the scene unfolds, the surgeon's face and actions reveal his fear, confusion, discomfort, and disorientation. The throat surgeon ends the examination by telling our hero that he has a growth on his vocal cords and will need a biopsy and other tests. As she leaves to move on to her next patient, the throat surgeon mutters, "Busy day, busy day." That tale was told by the late Peter Frost, a professor of management who undertook a campaign for medical compassion after his own experience in a cancer ward. The key element lacking in this scenario, Frost pointed out, is the simple recognition of the human being, the person struggling for dignity, even for life. That humanity too often gets lost in the impersonal machinery of modern medicine. Some argue that this mechanistic attitude leads to needless iatrogenic suffering, the anguish added when medical personnel leave their hearts at home. Even with dying people, insensitive messages from doctors can sometimes engender more emotional suffering than the illness itself. This recognition has spurred a movement toward patient-centered or relationship-centered medicine, enlarging the focus of medical attention beyond mere diagnosis to include the person being treated and improving the quality of connection between physician and patient. The movement to enlarge the place of communication and empathy in medicine highlights the difference between attitudes that are espoused and their actual practice. The first principle of the Code of Medical Ethics of the American Medical Association admonishes physicians to provide competent medical care with compassion. Most medical school curriculums include a module on doctor-patient relationships. Practicing physicians and nurses are routinely offered brush-up courses on interpersonal and communication skills. Yet, only in the last few years did the U.S. licensing exam for medicine begin to include an assessment of a doctor's ability to establish rapport and communicate with patients. Part of the impetus for this stricter new standard is defensive. A much-discussed study of how doctors talk to patients, featured in 1997 in the Journal of the American Medical Association, found that impaired communication, rather than the actual number of mishaps, largely predicted that a given physician would be sued for malpractice. By contrast, doctors whose patients felt more rapport sued them less. These doctors did simple things that helped. They told patients what to expect from their visit or treatment. engaged in small talk, touched them reassuringly, sat down with them, and laughed with them. Humor builds rapport quickly and powerfully. What's more, they made sure patients understood their comments, asked for their opinions, cleared up all their questions, and encouraged them to talk. In short, they showed an interest in the person, not just in the diagnosis. Time is a key ingredient in such care. These office visits ran about 3.5 minutes longer than those of doctors who were more likely to be sued. The shorter the visit, the more likely a malpractice claim. Establishing a good rapport takes a few minutes, a troubling observation given the increasing economic pressures on doctors to see more patients in less time. Even so, the scientific case for rapport building grows ever stronger. For instance, a review of studies found patient satisfaction to be highest when they felt a doctor was empathic and gave useful information. But patients sensed that a doctor's message was informative stemmed not just from what information was imparted, but from how. A tone of voice that showed concern and emotional engagement made a doctor's words seem more helpful. A bonus? The more satisfied the patients, the better they could recall the physician's instructions and greater their compliance. Beyond the medical case for rapport, there is also a business one. At least in the United States, where the medical marketplace grows ever more competitive, exit interviews with patients who have decided to quit their health plan reveal that 25% leave because I didn't like the way my physician communicated with me. Dr. Robin Youngson's transformation began the day his daughter was rushed to a hospital with a broken neck. For 90 days, he and his wife agonized while their daughter, just 5, lay tied down to a bed, able to see only the ceiling. The tribulation inspired Dr. Youngson, an anesthesiologist in Auckland, New Zealand, to begin a campaign to alter his country's legal code of patients' rights. He wants to add the right to be treated with compassion to every patient's existing rights to dignity and respect. For much of my career as a doctor, he confesses, I reduced the human being in front of me to a physiological preparation. But that I-it attitude, he now realizes, diminishes the full potential for a healing relationship. His daughter's hospitalization, he says, has brought me back to my humanity. To be sure, there are good-hearted people throughout any medical system. But the culture of medicine itself all too often stifles or destroys the expression of empathic concern, making caring into a victim not just of cost and time pressures, but also of what Dr. Youngson calls dysfunctional styles of thinking and belief of physicians: linear, reductionistic, overly critical and pessimistic, intolerant of ambiguity. We think that clinical detachment is the key to clear perception. Wrong. In Dr. Youngson's diagnosis, his profession suffers from a learned disability. We have utterly lost compassion. The main enemy, he says, is not so much the hearts of individual physicians and nurses, his own colleagues readily commit to kindness, but the inexorable press toward relying on medical technology. Add the relentless fragmentation of medical care, in which patients are shuttled from specialist to specialist, and the squeeze on nursing staff, in which one nurse covers ever more patients. Patients themselves often end up as the single person in charge of overseeing their medical care, whether they are equipped to do so or not. The word heal comes from the Old English hal, to make whole or mend. Healing has a broader meaning than simply curing a disease. It implies helping a person regain a sense of wholeness and emotional wellness. Patients need healing along with their medical care, and compassion heals in ways that no medicine or technology can.